I don't think it's a new concept at all. And at St Mary's, we're a Catholic university, and we draw on that intellectual tradition. And, you know, for us, we go back certainly to Thomas Aquinas and his approach, where he listed every argument, and then against every argument listed those arguments which would be against that argument. So constantly evaluating, testing, making sure that arguments stand up, testing what the opposition to them is, what alternative theories there might be, and then arriving at a conclusion about the way forward.
So critical thinking teaches you one side, but then you must consider the other.
Yeah, and maybe there'll be more than two. You know, it's about synthesizing, experiencing, understanding a whole variety of arguments, learning to evaluate them critically. In other words, not simply taking them at face value, learning to understand what might be determining those arguments, and then using your intellect to evaluate, balance, and reach a conclusion, which both can guide you in terms of what you might believe to be true or what you might believe to be right, but also guide you in terms of action. It isn't simply an intellectual exercise. It can be and should be a guide to action in the real world.
People would summarize it as thinking out of the box, and I've never quite known what that means. So perhaps you could explain a little more about that.
I think the thinking out of the box idea is the recognition that our thinking can be conditioned by habits, by a kind of mental laziness sometimes, or, and I think you see this increasingly nowadays, by a sense that our beliefs or our views are so important that they shouldn't be challenged. And so that reluctance to embrace challenge and to embrace a diversity of viewpoints, I think thinking outside the box, in other words, thinking outside those tram lines that your habits and maybe your upbringing have given you, can be, I think, a very important way of looking at particular problems or situations in a new and fresh way, leading to new knowledge.
I saw something recently saying that academia had turned in many places to imbecilia because they were challenging entirely the wrong things. Does that ring true or not?
Well, not at St Mary's. I would certainly say, you might expect me to say that, but I think it's true. I mean, clearly there's a debate in the university world, as you know, there is in the wider society at the moment, about striking that right balance between the freedom of expression for people to express their ideas, new ideas or challenging ideas, and the rights that we all have as individuals to be treated with respect and dignity. And, you know, getting that balance right is not easy. I think sometimes it's presented as in rather simplistic terms. But I think from a university's point of view, there has to be that fundamental recognition that the university tradition has been about freedom of expression and freedom to pursue particular avenues of knowledge. And that's really important for our academics, but it's also important for our students.
Who would you say are the best critical thinkers at the moment? Economists, academics, politicians, well, maybe not politicians, entrepreneurs, philosophers? Who are critical thinkers closest to?
I do think that the underpinning of philosophy is incredibly important. And again, with the tradition that we have at St Mary's, of coming from that Catholic intellectual tradition, it's always struck me that it's very interesting that in the training of Catholic priests, they spend 3 years studying philosophy before they're let loose on theology. So learning how to think even precedes learning how to think what you might regard as the heart of you know, their intellectual formation. However, you mentioned earlier on thinking out of the box, and there's no doubt, if I think about the interface between academia and the commercial world, that, you know, academics, like everyone else, can become trapped in habitual patterns of thinking. Entrepreneurs, because of the way that they approach the world and the way that they seek to solve, often very quickly, real life problems, can play an enormous part. I mean, if you think about the recent developments, particularly here, but in other countries too, in relation to the search for the COVID vaccine, you know, extraordinary partnerships really between the kind of thinking that goes on in academic institutions and the kind of thinking that goes on in commercial or entrepreneurial situations.
I've also read that being open-minded to solutions or ideas other than your own is essential to critical thinking. And having an ego is one of the biggest barriers. In such a narcissistic age, this must be a major hurdle to overcome.
I think that is absolutely right. I know it's actually quite a profound insight that, you know, which critical thinking might share with some of the world's great religious or philosophical traditions. You know, that critical thinking is at least in part about overcoming the ego, overcoming the tendency we all have to think we're right, the way we see the world is right. You know, it's the best way of seeing the world. But the dominance now in public communication of social media has led to, I think, in many cases, a situation where the ego is predominating. And of course, that makes people far less willing to accept other points of view, because they hear another point of view, one that perhaps is different to theirs or contradictory, directly contradictory to theirs. And rather than thinking, well, that's another perspective, let me evaluate that, let me see whether I think there's anything of merit there, they take it as a personal attack on them.
Which is why so much social media is poisonous, because people are thinking critically as opposed to critical thinking.
Yeah, thinking critically in that destructive sense of the word. You know, let's just tear someone down. Let's tear down that viewpoint, or let's silence it altogether because, you know, actually we don't agree and we think it's threatening to us or to me or to my sense of myself, my sense of my ego. I think it's a major issue. And of course, particularly younger students now, these are the so-called digital natives. They've grown up with this. It's not in any sense something they've learned. They've absorbed it. And therefore, you know, part of coming to university now is also learning, I think, to think freshly and think perhaps in ways which social media is not conducive towards.
I agree completely. Anthony McLaren, many thanks for joining us on The Agenda.
Thank you.